unknown woman texted me at 2 a.m. I am pregnant by your husband. We have been together for 3 years. My husband was sleeping right next to me. I quietly got up and did something that turned my life upside down. Good day, dear listeners. It's Briella again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I used to think I was one of the lucky ones. That's the thing about a happy life. You stop questioning it. You just live inside it like a warm house in winter, never wondering if the walls are real. My name is Rachel Harmon. I was 34 years old, a licensed occupational therapist working at a rehabilitation clinic in suburban Atlanta, Georgia. I drove a sensible Honda, kept a vegetable garden in the backyard, and made Daniel's coffee every morning the way he liked it. 2 sugars, a splash of oat milk, heated exactly 90 seconds in the microwave. We'd been married for 7 years. We had a dog named Cooper, a mortgage we were slowly winning against, and plans to visit Portugal the following spring. Our life was not glamorous, it was something better than that. It was steady. Daniel worked in corporate IT consulting. He traveled, always had, even before we married. Chicago 1 week, Dallas the next. I had made peace with the empty side of the bed years ago. Some wives resented that kind of schedule. I told myself it kept us from taking each other for granted. I told myself a lot of things. The first sign, if I'm honest, came 8 months before that night. It was small. So small I almost didn't catch it. We were having dinner on a Tuesday, pasta, nothing special, and Daniel's phone lit up on the counter. I wasn't snooping. I was reaching for the Parmesan. The name on the screen said K, just 1 letter. I glanced at it the way you glance at anything, reflexively without meaning to. And when I looked up, Daniel had already crossed the kitchen and flipped the phone face down. "Work," he said before I asked anything. I didn't ask anything. A month later, he started sleeping with his phone on his side of the bed instead of charging it on the dresser. He said the dresser outlet was loose. I checked it the next day. It worked fine. Then came the cologne. After 11 years together, 4 dating, 7 married, I knew every bottle in his cabinet. He'd worn the same cedar and citrus scent since his late 20s. One Saturday in February, I hugged him before he left for what he called a team offsite, and I breathed in something different, warmer, softer, almost floral. The kind of scent you pick up when you've been close to someone who wears perfume. I stood on the porch and watched his car back out of the driveway. Cooper sat beside me, ears forward. I was being paranoid, I told myself. I was stressed from work. I was projecting. I kept telling myself that through March and into April. Through the weekend, he came home from Chicago with a tan line I couldn't explain. Through the Thursday, he called to say he'd be late, and I heard faintly the sound of a restaurant, silverware, low music, and then silence as if he'd stepped outside. I told myself marriages go through seasons. I told myself I was enough. Then came the night of April 14th. Daniel had fallen asleep early. I was still awake, sitting up against the headboard with a book I wasn't reading. The window was cracked and Atlanta's spring air came through the curtain in slow, warm waves. Cooper was a dead weight across my feet. The bedside clock read 2:07 a.m. My phone buzzed. An unknown number. I almost ignored it. But something, some quiet animal instinct made me open it. Hi. I don't know how to say this, so I'm just gonna say it. My name is Kristen. I've been with your husband for 3 years. I'm 12 weeks pregnant with his child. I'm sorry, I thought you deserved to know. I read it 3 times. Then I read it a 4th time slowly, like a document I was trying to notarize in my own mind. Daniel was asleep 6 inches to my left. I could hear him breathing, that low, familiar rhythm I had listened to for years, that sound I had once found so comforting I used to fall asleep to it on purpose. Now it felt like something being played from a recording, like the sound of a stranger. I didn't wake him. I didn't scream. I didn't throw anything. I set the phone face down on the nightstand, exactly the way he set his phone when Kay called. I lay back against the pillow and stared at the ceiling and felt something inside me go very, very quiet. Not numb, quiet. The way a room goes quiet when someone has just said something that cannot be unsaid. Cooper shifted against my feet. The curtain moved. Daniel breathed. And I began in the dark to think. I did not sleep. By the time the room began to lighten, that gray pre-dawn that comes before actual sunrise, I had been lying still for 4 hours. Not frozen. Thinking. Daniel woke at 6:15, the same as always. He padded to the bathroom, showered, came back smelling of the cedar and citrus soap I'd bought him for Christmas. I kept my eyes closed. I listened to the sounds of him dressing, watched through my lashes as he picked up his phone from the nightstand without checking it in front of me. Just pocketed it and left the room. 10 minutes later, I heard the coffee maker start downstairs. He made his own coffee that morning. He didn't know I was already awake. I stayed in bed until I heard his car leave the driveway. Then I sat up and I looked at my phone and I read Kristen's message one more time. 3 years. 3 years ago, I had been planning our 7th anniversary trip. 3 years ago, we had talked, seriously, with spreadsheets and everything, about whether we were ready to try for a baby. I had been the one who said not yet. Let's wait 1 more year. I had carried that small private guilt ever since, this feeling that I had somehow let time slip past us. And all this time, he'd been building an entire second life. I sat on the edge of the bed with my feet on the floor, and I did what I've always done when something overwhelming lands in front of me. I made a list. Not on paper. In my head. What do I know? A woman named Kristen claims she has been in a relationship with my husband for 3 years. She claims to be 12 weeks pregnant. She reached out to me at 2 a.m. from an unknown number. What don't I know? Whether it's true. Whether this is some kind of manipulation, a mistake, a wrong number. Whether Daniel knows she contacted me. What are my options? Confront Daniel immediately. Contact Kristen. Say nothing and gather information first. Leave. I sat with those options for a long time. Every cell in my body wanted to walk downstairs, drive to wherever he was, and put the phone in front of his face. That urge was so strong it felt almost physical. A pulling sensation in my chest. But I had watched enough of my therapy clients blow up their own cases, their own custody hearings, their own financial settlements by reacting before they had the full picture. Emotion is human, but emotion without information is just noise. And I needed more than noise. I needed proof. Because here is what I understood in that gray Atlanta morning. Sitting on the edge of the bed we had shared for 7 years. If this was real, my entire life was about to change. Not just emotionally, legally, financially, practically. I had a mortgage in both our names. I had a joint savings account. I had a life insurance policy where Daniel was the beneficiary. I had health insurance through his employer. I was not naive. I worked with patients every day who were rebuilding their lives after something had destroyed the version they'd counted on. I knew what that kind of rebuilding actually cost, in time, in money, in the sheer daily exhaustion of starting over. I was not going to walk into that process empty-handed and angry, handing him the advantage simply because I couldn't wait. So I made a decision. I would say nothing to Daniel, not yet. The first thing I did was screenshot Kristen's message and email it to myself. Then I downloaded a secure cloud backup app and saved it there too. Then I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and opened our joint bank account. I looked at the transaction history for the past 18 months. In 2 hours, I found 11 charges I couldn't explain. 4 hotel bookings in cities Daniel had claimed to visit for work. But the hotels were boutique, expensive, not the corporate chains his company typically used. 3 restaurant charges in those same cities, all dinners, all over $100. 2 charges at a jewelry store in downtown Atlanta I had never heard of. 1 charge at a spa, 1 at a florist. I sat back and looked at the screen. He had been spending our money on her. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I thought I would be shaking or crying or both. Instead, I felt something settle in my chest, something cold and clarifying, like the moment before you walk into a difficult conversation and you finally know exactly what you're going to say. I was going to need a lawyer. I was going to need documentation. And I was going to need to respond to Kristen, carefully, strategically, on my terms. I picked up my phone and typed a single reply to her unknown number. "Thank you for telling me. Please don't contact him before we speak. I'll reach out soon." Then I went upstairs, showered, got dressed, and drove to work. Because the one thing I could not afford to do was let Daniel see that anything had changed. Not yet. My colleague Marissa had gone through a divorce 3 years earlier. She never talked about it unprompted, but I remembered what she'd said once in the break room, stirring her coffee. The lawyer saved me, not emotionally, legally. Get one before you do anything else. I called her that afternoon from my car in the clinic parking lot. I told her I needed a referral. She didn't ask questions. She texted me a name within the hour, Sandra Okafor, Family Law, Buckhead. I called and made an appointment for the following Monday, saying it was a consultation. Then I sat in the car for a moment and breathed. The weekend was the hardest part. Daniel came home Friday evening with Thai food and a bottle of white wine, and we ate dinner on the couch watching a documentary about national parks. And I smiled at the right moments and laughed when he laughed and refilled his glass when it was empty. The whole time I felt like I was watching myself from slightly outside my own body. A calm, pleasant woman having a calm, pleasant evening with a man whose phone buzzed twice during the documentary and who glanced at it both times in a way that had no good explanation. Saturday, he went to the gym. I waited until I heard his car leave, then went to his home office. I wasn't searching for anything dramatic. I wasn't going to find love letters tied with ribbon. But I was an observant person, and I had lived with this man for 11 years, and I knew where things lived. I looked through his desk quickly and carefully, replacing everything exactly as I found it. In the bottom drawer, under a folder of old tax returns, I found a receipt, a printed receipt, creased as if it had been in a pocket, from a hotel in Nashville, dated 8 months ago, room for 2. 8 months ago, he had told me he was in Denver. I took a photo of it with my phone, replaced it under the folder, closed the drawer, and went back to the kitchen to start the grocery list I had told him I was working on. On Sunday evening, I replied to Kristen. I asked her if she was willing to meet in person. I suggested a coffee shop near my clinic, neutral, public, quiet enough to talk. She responded within 20 minutes. Yes, whenever works for you. We met Tuesday at noon. She was younger than I expected, 28, maybe 29. Dark hair, careful eyes, visibly nervous. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup like it was the only solid thing available. She was 12 weeks pregnant, she told me. She had found out a month ago. She had told Daniel immediately. What did he say? I asked. Her jaw tightened. He told me to take care of it, that he wasn't going to leave his wife. She looked at me directly then, and I saw something complicated in her face. Not malice, not satisfaction. Something more like exhausted shame. I'm not trying to blow up your life. I'm keeping this baby, and I needed you to know the truth. I asked her how they had met, a work conference in Charlotte 3 years ago. I asked if she had anything in writing, texts, emails, anything. She had everything. She pulled out her phone and handed it to me, and I sat in that coffee shop in Buckhead and scrolled through 3 years of messages between my husband and a woman I'd never heard of 48 hours ago. Declarations, plans, arrangements, arguments about the baby. His response when she told him, "You need to handle this. I can't do this right now." 3 years, 12 weeks pregnant. A hotel receipt from a trip that never happened. I handed her phone back. "Can you send me screenshots of the most relevant ones?" I asked. "For my own records." She nodded. She sent them before I left the table. That evening, Daniel came home and asked how my day was. I said it was busy. I made chicken and roasted vegetables. I set his plate in front of him and watched him eat and said very little, which was not unusual enough to alarm him. But something had shifted in him in the past few days. I could feel it. He was quieter, more attentive in a watchful way, not a warm way. He'd looked at me twice that morning with an expression I couldn't name, something between assessment and unease. Whether it was guilt cycling back to the surface, or whether Kristen had somehow told him she'd contacted me, I didn't know yet. What I knew was that I had a hotel receipt, 3 years of text messages, credit card records, and an appointment with Sandra Okafor on Monday morning. The point of no return was behind me now. I had crossed it Tuesday at noon, sitting across from a pregnant woman in a coffee shop, scrolling through the evidence of my husband's other life. There was no version of this where I looked away. Sandra Okafor's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building on Peachtree Road, with a view of the city and the kind of quiet that only expensive carpeting can produce. She was 52, precise, and she listened to everything I said without interrupting. Then she looked at the screenshots, the credit card records, the photo of the hotel receipt, and she leaned back in her chair. "Georgia is an equitable distribution state," she said. "Adultery is legally recognized as fault, and it can affect the division of marital assets. You have documentation of marital funds being used for the affair. That's significant." She paused. "You've been very organized." "I had a few days to prepare," I said. We talked for 90 minutes. By the end, I had a clear picture of what the process looked like. Filing for divorce on grounds of adultery, freezing the joint accounts to prevent dissipation of assets, establishing a temporary financial order. Sandra also recommended I move a portion of my direct deposits to a personal account, not marital funds, just my own future income, and document everything going forward. I signed the retainer that afternoon. On Wednesday, Daniel was served at his office. I was not there. I was at the clinic doing a hand therapy session with a 60-year-old man who was recovering from a wrist fracture. My phone was in my pocket and I felt it buzz twice during the session. When I checked it on my break, I had 14 missed calls from Daniel, 3 texts that escalated from Rachel. Call me to what did you do to I need you to stop this right now. I sent a single reply, all communication through my attorney. You have her number. He came home that evening anyway. I had expected that. I was sitting at the kitchen table with Cooper at my feet when I heard his key in the lock. The conversation that followed was the most unpleasant 40 minutes of my life, and I have sat with people in I See Us. He cycled through denial, then anger, then a version of explanation that tried to recast 3 years as something that just happened, as if his life were a weather event he'd been caught in. He said Kristen meant nothing. He said the pregnancy was a complication neither of them had intended. He said, "Can we please just talk about this like adults," while standing in the kitchen raising his voice. I said, "I am talking to you like an adult. I filed for divorce. That is the adult decision I made." Then Kristen called him. I watched his face change when he saw her name. He stepped into the hallway to answer. I heard his end of it. I know. She already... Yes. Stop. A pause. I'll handle it. When he came back, his expression had changed. The desperation had hardened into something colder. "Rachel," he said carefully, "Kristen is willing to say that the messages you have were sent under duress, that you pressured her into giving them to you, that the whole meeting was manipulative." I looked at him. "She's willing to say that?" I asked. "She doesn't want legal trouble," he said. "Neither of us does. If you drop the adultery claim and we do this quietly, we split everything 50-50 and nobody has to drag anything through court." There it was, the two of them, coordinating, threatening to recant the very evidence Kristen had handed me voluntarily in a coffee shop. "Tell your attorney to call my attorney," I said. He left that night. And then I went upstairs and sat on the bathroom floor for a while, which is something I'd done since college when things were bad. The cold tile, the small room, the door closed. I wasn't falling apart. I just needed to sit somewhere that had walls on 4 sides. After 20 minutes, I got up, washed my face, and called my sister in Nashville. I took Friday and the weekend off. I drove to Nashville. I slept in my childhood bedroom at my parents' house and ate my mother's cooking and let Cooper run in the backyard. I didn't look at my phone except to check messages from Sandra. I went to bed at 9:30 on Saturday night and slept for 10 hours. I needed those days, not to recover, to reload. By Sunday evening, I was ready to go back. I came back to Atlanta on Sunday evening, and by Monday morning, Daniel had changed tactics. The aggressive texts had stopped. In their place came something more dangerous, the tender version. A voicemail, soft-voiced, almost gentle, left at 7 a.m. while I was in the shower. "Rachel, I've been thinking about everything. I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose what we built. I know I destroyed your trust, and I have no right to ask anything of you, but I'm asking anyway. Can we just talk? Not lawyers, not documents. Just us, the way we used to." A pause. "I love you. I've always loved you. What Kristen and I had, it wasn't love. You have to know that." I listened to it in my car before driving to the clinic. Then I deleted it. Did he love me? Maybe. In some diminished, self-serving way that prioritized his own comfort over my dignity. Probably yes. But love, I had learned. In 7 years of marriage, and in 11 years of knowing this man, and in years of sitting across from patients who were rebuilding after loss, love is not a feeling. It is a set of choices, made daily in small moments when no one is watching. He had made his choices. For 3 years, he had made them consistently. He sent flowers to the clinic, white tulips my favorite. I asked the receptionist to forward them to the waiting room. He texted on Wednesday, "I keep thinking about Portugal. We were so excited about Portugal." I read it and put my phone in my desk drawer. What I noticed during those days was the watching. I could feel it even from a distance, the slight shift in Daniel's behavior that told me he and Kristen were monitoring, waiting to see if the flowers worked, if the voicemail softened something, if I would call. It had the quality of a held breath. They were waiting for me to flinch. I did not flinch. Instead, I went to dinner with Marissa on Thursday. We sat at a small Italian place near the clinic, and I told her in full what had happened. She listened without dramatic reaction, which was exactly what I needed. She'd been through enough of her own to know that gasping and outrage, however well-intentioned, doesn't actually help. "Sandra's good," she said. "You're in good hands legally. What about you personally?" I thought about it. "I'm angry," I said. "But the anger feels useful, not messy. Does that make sense?" She nodded slowly. "That's the best kind," she said. I also called my friend Dana, who was a CPA and who had, during her own divorce 4 years ago, learned more about financial documentation than she ever expected to. She came over Saturday afternoon and we went through my accounts together. Personal, joint, retirement. She flagged 2 things I hadn't noticed. A recurring transfer to an account I didn't recognize, small enough to overlook, consistent enough to be a pattern. $250 every 3rd Friday for the past 20 months. I photographed the transaction history and forwarded it to Sandra. That, Sandra wrote back within the hour, is what we call dissipation of marital assets. Very helpful. I also did something I had been avoiding. I called my mother, not my parents together, just my mother, on a Sunday evening when the house was quiet and Cooper was asleep in the chair across from me. I told her everything. She was silent for a long time. Then she said, "Rachel, you are the most capable person I have ever known, and I want you to hear me say that, not because I'm your mother, but because it is factually true. You're going to be fine. You're going to be better than fine." I didn't cry until after we hung up. But when I did, it wasn't the grief kind. It was the kind that comes when you've been carrying something alone for too long and someone finally sees the weight. Across town, Daniel waited. Kristen waited. They were watching, calculating, measuring the silence. Let them watch, I thought. I'm not the one who should be afraid. They came on a Thursday evening. I hadn't expected them together. That was the part that surprised me. I heard the doorbell at 6:45. Cooper barked once. I looked through the side window and saw Daniel standing on the porch, and behind him, slightly to the left, Kristen. She was wearing a loose gray top that showed the very beginning of her pregnancy, and she had her arms folded across herself in a way that looked both defensive and deliberate. I opened the door. "Rachel," Daniel said. His voice was warm, careful. The voice he used in professional settings when he needed to move someone toward agreement. "We just need 10 minutes. That's all." I looked at Kristen. She met my eyes, then looked away. Against my better judgment, or perhaps because of it, because I wanted to see exactly what they were doing, I stepped back and let them in. We stood in the living room. I did not offer them a seat. Daniel sat on the couch anyway. Kristen remained standing near the doorway, which told me this had been staged. He was going to do the talking. "We've been thinking," he said, "about the baby, about what this whole situation does to everyone. He spread his hands in a gesture I recognized as his "let's be reasonable" pose. A court case is going to be brutal. For you, for me, for Kristen, for the baby, eventually. Kids grow up and they find things, Rachel. Do you really want a child growing up knowing his parents' dirty laundry was aired in a courthouse? His parents, I said. You mean you and Kristen? A flicker of something in his jaw. I mean all of us. We're all connected now, whether we wanted to be or not. Then Kristen spoke. Her voice was quieter than I expected, and more controlled. I know I reached out to you first, and I know you went and talked to a lawyer the same week. But Rachel, she paused, and her eyes did something complicated. You have to understand. The screenshots I sent you, the things I said at that coffee shop, I was emotional. I wasn't thinking clearly. I'm not sure I'd testify to any of it. There it was again. Dressed up now in a softer package. Not a threat delivered over a phone with Daniel coaching in the background, but delivered to my face, with her standing in my living room looking like the victim of her own story. You're saying you'd lie under oath, I said. I'm saying I'd tell the truth about my emotional state, she said carefully. That's not lying. I looked at them both. Daniel with his open, reasonable hands. Kristen with her careful eyes and her folded arms and her very visible pregnancy. They had come here prepared. They had probably discussed this for hours, maybe days. What angle to try, what to offer, how to frame retreat as a peace proposal. I could picture it. The two of them at some kitchen table I'd never seen, running through scenarios, rehearsing lines, deciding who would speak first and who would stay quiet and what expression would be most disarming. The performance was almost impressive. Almost. And what were they actually offering? Drop the adultery claim. Take the 50-50 split. Which, given the asset dissipation I'd discovered with Dana, would mean I was absorbing losses I had not created. Except that the woman standing in my living room might perjure herself without consequence, smile and call it resolution. What struck me most standing there was how little they thought of me. That was the real insult underneath the proposal, not the words, but the assumption that I could be moved by flowers and nostalgia and a carefully calculated visit. That 7 years of my life had produced a woman who would be managed back into silence with the right combination of pressure and sentiment. They had underestimated me completely and they didn't even know it yet. I appreciate you coming, I said, but I want you both to leave now. Daniel's face changed. The warmth evaporated. Rachel, you need to think about what you're doing. A divorce on fault grounds gets expensive. It gets ugly. It takes years sometimes. You're going to spend your savings on attorney fees and end up with the same result. Please leave, I said. You're being irrational. I'm being extremely rational, I said. That is the problem you're having with me right now. Kristen touched Daniel's arm. He stopped talking. They looked at me for a moment. Both of them, this couple in my living room, in the home I had lived in for 6 years. And then Daniel walked to the door and opened it, and they left. I closed it behind them. I locked it. I stood in the hallway with my back against the wall and Cooper pressing his nose to my hand. My heart was beating fast. I won't pretend otherwise. There was fear there. Real fear. The kind that settles in your stomach when you understand that people you once trusted are now aligned against you and willing to use any tool available. That is a frightening thing to know, but the fear did something unexpected. It didn't make me want to give in. It made me want to be more careful, more thorough, more certain. I went to my desk, opened my laptop, and emailed Sandra. They came to my home together this evening. Kristen verbally suggested she would not confirm prior statements if this went to court. I want everything we have locked down. What are our next steps? Sandra replied within the hour. I've been waiting for something like this. I'll tell you exactly what we do next. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday in September, 5 months after the night of Kristen's first message. Sandra had been building toward this methodically. The bank records, the hotel receipt, the screenshots, which, it turned out, Kristen could not legally recant simply by claiming emotional distress because I had received them voluntarily in a public place without coercion, and Sandra had a signed statement from the coffee shop's owner confirming we had sat there calmly for 40 minutes. The recurring transfers to the unrecognized account, which Sandra's financial investigator had traced to a second checking account Daniel had opened 18 months into the affair, an account with a debit card he had apparently given Kristen. There was also something we had not planned for, which arrived 6 weeks before the deposition via Sandra's office. Kristen's own attorney had reached out. She had hired someone, and her attorney had informed Sandra confidentially that Kristen was reconsidering her position. What does that mean? I asked Sandra. It means she's beginning to understand that Daniel's interests and her interests are not the same, Sandra said. He told her to recant your evidence because it protects him. It doesn't do anything for her. She's having his baby and he told her to get rid of it. She's starting to do the math. I thought about that. I had no warmth for Kristen. She had known he was married. She had made her choices too, but I understood what it meant to be on the receiving end of Daniel's careful self-preservation, and I could imagine what those 5 months had looked like for her. Pregnant, increasingly alone in the practical sense, discovering that the man who had promised her something across 3 years of hotel rooms and careful texts was, when pressed, primarily interested in protecting himself. That is a particular kind of disillusionment. I didn't feel sorry for her, but I understood the arithmetic. The deposition took place in a conference room on the 9th floor of Sandra's building. Daniel sat across the table with his attorney, a man named Greaves, who had the practiced neutrality of someone paid not to have reactions. Daniel was wearing the charcoal suit he saved for important meetings. He looked tired, not the tired of someone who hadn't slept, the tired of someone who had been managing too many versions of the same story for too long and was beginning to lose track of the seams. Sandra began. The questions were methodical: dates, locations, financial transactions. Daniel answered carefully, always careful, threading his words to minimize and reframe. Then Sandra put the bank statements on the table, the transfers, the secondary account. Mr. Harmon, can you explain the purpose of the recurring transfers to this account number? A pause. That was a personal savings arrangement. A savings arrangement in an account with a debit card issued to a Kristen Mercer? The stillness that came over Daniel's face in that moment. I had seen something like it once before, years ago, when he'd been caught in a small domestic lie, the kind that doesn't matter, and the expression was the same, a very fast recalibration behind the eyes. But this time, the calculation had nowhere to land. There was no plausible explanation that fit the evidence. There was no version of the story that Sandra hadn't already accounted for. The room had the particular tension of a space in which someone is running out of exits and knows it. It was a joint account, he said carefully. You had a joint account with Ms. Mercer for 20 months while married to my client, Greaves interjected, but Sandra was already moving to the next document. The hotel receipt, the credit card charges in cities that didn't match his expense reports. Each page placed on the table with the same quiet precision, the same unhurried tempo, the same complete absence of theatrical flourish. Sandra didn't need drama. The facts were doing all the work. Here is what happened then. Daniel stopped being careful. I don't know if it was accumulated pressure or Greaves failing to signal him in time, or the sheer momentum of having every documented fact laid in sequence in front of him. But he looked up from the hotel receipt and said with sudden heat, "None of this would exist if she hadn't gone behind my back and dug all of this up." Sandra let the silence last 4 full seconds. "Are you saying my client should not have investigated evidence of your affair?" "I'm saying this whole thing has been handled vindictively," he said. His voice had an edge now, not loud, but raw. "She met with Kristen behind my back. She went through my office. You chose to conduct a 3-year extramarital relationship using marital funds," Sandra said. "My client organized the documentation. Those are different things." He was breathing harder now. Greaves touched his arm. Daniel shook it off. "What do you want?" he said, looking directly at me for the first time all morning. Not at Sandra, at me. "What is it you actually want from this?" It was the first honest question he had asked me in months, maybe years, and I noticed, in the asking, how much it revealed that he had expected, somewhere beneath the legal proceedings and the careful posturing, that there was something I could be offered, something that would make me redirect or soften or settle for less. He still believed this was a negotiation. He still believed I had a price. I looked at him. "I want what's fair," I said. "That's all I've ever wanted." He looked away first. Outside the conference room during the break, I stood by the window with a cup of water and looked at the Atlanta skyline and felt not triumphant, not relieved, not vindicated, just still. The way you feel when something that has been uncertain for a long time finally resolves into a single clear shape. The deposition was the end of the fight, even if the paperwork would take months more. Daniel knew it. I could see it in the set of his shoulders when he came back into the room. The man who had bet on my silence had miscalculated. I had never been the silent type. I had just needed time to find the right words. The divorce was finalized on a Friday in November, 8 months after Kristen's 2 a.m. message. Georgia's equitable distribution law applied to a fault-based divorce with documented adultery and asset dissipation looked like this. I received 62% of our joint marital assets. I kept the house. Daniel's retirement contributions made during the period of the affair were factored into the calculation. His attorney had fought that, but Sandra had been thorough, and the documentation was overwhelming. The secondary account, the transfers, the hotel stays charged to our joint card. All of it had been treated as marital funds diverted for the benefit of the affair partner, which under Georgia law carries real financial consequence. Daniel also lost the IT consulting partnership he had been pursuing for the previous 2 years. His partner, a man named Carl who had worked with Daniel for a decade, called it off 3 weeks after the deposition. I don't know everything that Carl knew or how he came to know it, but reputation in Atlanta's professional class moves the way it always has. Through conversation, through inference, through the kinds of details that circulate at dinners and don't need to be stated directly. Daniel's outburst in the deposition room, That unguarded moment when he had blamed me for finding the evidence of his own affair had not stayed private. Depositions have transcripts. Transcripts have a way of existing in the world. He'd been so careful for 3 years. And then, in one room, on one Tuesday morning in September, he had let the careful slip. That is often how it goes. People who maintain deception for a long time tend to hold it together precisely until the moment they believe they're losing, and then the energy required to keep the structure standing simply gives out. What comes through in those moments is the truest available version of a person. What came through Daniel was blame. That told me everything I needed to know about who he had actually been. Underneath the cedar and citrus cologne and the coffee made exactly right, and the 7 years of a life I had believed in. On the day the divorce was finalized, I drove to Sandra's office, signed the last documents, and shook her hand. She held mine for a moment. "You handled this exceptionally well," she said. "I had a good lawyer," I said. "You came in organized," she said. "Most people don't. It makes a real difference." I picked up Cooper from the house that afternoon, the house that was now officially entirely mine, and we drove to Piedmont Park and walked for an hour in the November light. The trees were bare, and the air had that particular Atlanta chill that never quite gets as cold as you expect. And Cooper ran ahead of me on the path and doubled back and ran ahead again, boundless and uncomplicated. I sat on a bench by the lake for a while. I had not cried much through any of this. Not because I hadn't felt it. I had felt all of it. The grief and the betrayal and the strange particular sorrow of watching someone you loved reveal themselves to be someone you hadn't known. But because the feeling had never quite overwhelmed the doing. The planning and the documenting and the sitting in Sandra's office and the deposition and the paperwork, all of it had required a level of clarity that didn't leave room for collapse. I had cried once on the phone with my mother. I had cried a second time the night the divorce was finalized, alone in the house with the dog asleep at my feet and the rooms quiet around me. Both times I let it come fully and then I let it go. What Daniel got was 42% of the assets, which was still substantial. He got the car he had taken with him when he left. He got whatever Kristen had to offer, which by that point was unclear. What he did not get was the ability to rewrite what had happened. The record existed, the transcript existed, the financial investigator's report existed. Whatever story he chose to tell himself going forward would have to contend with the documented version permanently, in the permanent way that legal proceedings tend to produce. What I got was the house, the majority of what we had built, and the absence of a man who had been lying to me for 3 years. The math was obvious. On the Saturday after the finalization, my parents drove down from Nashville. My mother brought a casserole. My father walked every room of the house slowly, touching walls, checking windows, doing the things fathers do when they need to make sure their daughter is safe and don't know how else to express it. He fixed the loose porch board that Daniel had been meaning to get to for 2 years. It took him 20 minutes. He didn't say anything about it. He just came inside, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and sat down at the table as if fixing things were simply what you did when they were broken. Marissa came over that evening. Dana came too, and my friend Priya, who had flown in from Boston for the weekend without being asked. We sat in the living room and ordered pizza and talked about everything except the divorce, and then eventually talked about the divorce, and then eventually talked about other things again. Cooper moved between laps like a small, warm ambassador. At some point during the evening, I looked around that room, at those faces, that particular collection of people who had shown up, and I thought, this is what I actually had, this whole time. Right here. I had been so afraid of what I was losing. I hadn't seen clearly enough what I already had. A year and a half later, my life looked nothing like it had, and I meant that in the best possible way. I had refinanced the house in my name alone, and what had once felt like our home had slowly, room by room, become mine. I painted the kitchen the deep blue-green I had always wanted and Daniel had always vetoed. I converted the spare bedroom into a proper home office. I planted a second vegetable garden along the south fence. Cooper had a dog door now, which I had wanted for years and which Daniel had claimed would compromise the house's integrity. As if there were some irony in that particular concern. In retrospect, I had also started my own practice. 18 months after the divorce, I left the clinic and opened a small occupational therapy office with a colleague named James, a quiet, methodical man who had been talking about going independent for years. We had 4 therapists by spring and a waiting list by summer. It was mine, genuinely mine, built from the ground up in the specific shape I had imagined. And the satisfaction of that was unlike anything I had felt in a long time. I traveled. Portugal, the trip Daniel and I had planned and never taken. I went with Priya in the autumn, and it was nothing like what I had imagined and entirely better. We rented a small apartment in Lisbon for 2 weeks and ate well and walked everywhere and came home with the particular lightness that follows a trip you didn't compromise on. I went on 3 dates over the course of that year. One was awkward in a gentle, forgettable way. One was pleasant but led nowhere. One ended with a conversation so good we stayed at the restaurant for 4 hours, and I drove home grinning to myself like an idiot in the dark. And we were, as of that November, something I was still finding the right word for. But something real, something steady, something built on honesty from the first sentence. His name was Marcus. He had 2 large dogs and a dry sense of humor, and he'd been through his own version of loss and had come out of it clear-eyed. He made his own coffee, which I found unexpectedly appealing. It would be false to say the damage from those years was nothing. I had learned something about trust that I could not unlearn, not as bitterness, but as information. I was more careful now, more deliberate. I asked more questions in the early stages of things, and I paid attention to answers in a way I hadn't always thought to before. That was not damage, I decided. That was just knowing better. As for Daniel, what I knew came in pieces, through mutual acquaintances and through the ordinary way that news travels in a city where you share a social radius with someone. The partnership with Carl had not been rebuilt. Daniel had taken a position with a different firm, a smaller one, with less autonomy and lower compensation. He and Kristen were, by all accounts, together. That had surprised some people. It had not surprised me. Kristen had made a calculation and he had made one. And here they were, 2 people who had organized their lives around deception, now organizing their lives around each other, which is its own kind of consequence. Their baby had been born in October, a boy. I knew this because it appeared briefly on social media in a way that mutual connections shared without thinking. I looked at the photo for a moment. A newborn, which is to say a newborn small and red and entirely unaware. And I felt nothing toward the child except the ordinary wish that it be fed and safe and unharmed by the adults around it. For the adults around it, I felt something cooler. By all available evidence, Kristen and Daniel's relationship had the structural qualities of something built in a hurry on an unstable foundation. The early social media presence was bright and performative in the way that overcorrecting tends to be. By spring, it had quieted. There were reports, through Marissa, who heard through a mutual friend, of arguments, of financial strain, of Kristen discovering that the version of Daniel who had maintained a 7-year marriage and a parallel relationship was not, in fact, a man with limitless capacity for devotion, but a man with a fixed amount of attention distributed across multiple claimants. Without me absorbing the majority of that weight, the structure looked different. I did not feel satisfaction at this. Exactly. Satisfaction implies the outcome gave me something I needed. I was already full. What I felt was clarity. The sense that the world had arranged itself logically, that cause had produced effect, that people's choices had returned to them in the shapes those choices deserved. My vegetable garden produced an extraordinary amount of tomatoes that summer. I had not expected that. I gave bags of them to neighbors, to Marissa, to Dana. I left a bag on my parents' doorstep in Nashville when I drove up to visit in August, and my mother made sauce that lasted them into November. I stood at the kitchen sink one evening in early October, washing dishes while Marcus sat at the table behind me talking about something funny that had happened at his office, Cooper at his feet, the kitchen glowing with the new blue-green paint, and I thought, this is it. This is the thing I almost stayed silent to protect. I had almost stayed silent. I had almost absorbed the message from that night and locked it inside and said nothing and kept the life I had, the appearance of a life, the warm house with the cracked walls. I was so grateful I hadn't. Silence protects the person counting on it, never you. I was 34 when that message arrived in the dark. I am 37 now, and my life is entirely my own. Document everything. Trust your instincts. Find good people and hold them close. The life you're afraid to lose may not be the life you actually have. What would you have done that night? Would you have stayed silent? Tell me in the comments. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And thank you, genuinely, for listening all the way to the end.